Modern Bulgaria is a South Slavic country. Its language belongs to the Slavic branch of the Indo-European family, and its medieval literary tradition helped shape the Orthodox Slavic world well beyond its borders. In that sense, its Slavic identity appears straightforward. Yet the state that gave Bulgaria its name was founded in 681 by a group known as the Bulgars, a people most historians classify as Turkic-speaking. Under the leadership of Khan Asparuh, they defeated Byzantine forces and established a political entity in the northeastern Balkans that endured for more than 3 centuries. The contrast is difficult to ignore. The language of the modern nation is Slavic. The founders of the state were not Slavic in origin, and the land itself had been inhabited long before either group arrived. Before the 7th century, the Balkans were home to populations descended from the ancient Thracians, an Indo-European civilization that had gradually been incorporated into the Roman Empire. By the time the Bulgars entered the region, much of the local population consisted of Romanized and Hellenized Balkan communities. At the same time, Slavic-speaking groups had already begun settling across the peninsula during the 6th and 7th centuries, as Byzantine authority weakened. By the late 7th century, the region held the accumulation of multiple historical layers. Rulers can change within a generation. Populations change more slowly. The central question then is which of these layers most decisively shaped the modern population? Was it the founding elite who gave the state its name, the Slavic migrations that transformed the region, or the earlier Balkan communities who remained long after empires changed? For centuries, these questions were debated through chronicles, language, and archaeology. Today, they can also be examined through genetics, which allows us to compare historical narratives with measurable patterns of ancestry.
Long before there were Slavs in the Balkans, long before there were Bulgars, the region had already undergone 2 profound demographic transformations. The first began around 7000 to 6000 BCE, when agriculture entered Europe through the movement of farming populations from northwestern Anatolia. Genetic evidence shows that the earliest agricultural communities in southeastern Europe descended primarily from populations in northwestern Anatolia. Ancient DNA from early Neolithic sites across the Balkans demonstrates that these early farmers were not simply locals who adopted agriculture. They were migrants. Genome-wide studies, including Matheson A. 2018, show that early Neolithic individuals in present-day Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and Croatia derive roughly 98% of their ancestry from populations closely related to Anatolian Neolithic farmers. Such a high degree of genetic continuity suggests demographic migration, not simply the transfer of agricultural knowledge. These early European farmers established the first major genetic layer of a region. Principal component analyses consistently show Neolithic Balkan samples clustering tightly with Anatolian farmers, so this ancestry formed a central component of the region's genetic structure. Yet this was only the beginning of the region's demographic transformation. The Balkans were not an empty canvas. Indigenous Mesolithic hunter-gatherers still occupied parts of southeastern Europe. Most early farmers show limited interaction with them, yet sites such as Malik Preslavets in northern Bulgaria tell a more complex story. Individuals from this mid-6th millennium BCE site show substantial hunter-gatherer ancestry, modeled at approximately 15% Western hunter-gatherer and 4% Eastern hunter-gatherer. That suggests local admixture along river corridors, such as the Danube.
Even at this early stage, the Balkans were already a genetic contact zone. Then, nearly 3,000 years later, another transformation occurred. Around 3300 to 2500 BCE, pastoralist groups associated with the Yamnaya culture expanded westward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This event has been documented in detail by Hawk et al. 2015, Matheson et al. 2018, and more recently synthesized in Lazaridis et al. 2022 in the Southern Arc study. These steppe populations carried a distinctive genetic profile, a mixture of Eastern European hunter-gatherers, EHG, and Caucasus hunter-gatherers, CHG, roughly in equal proportions. This EHG plus CHG blend is what geneticists refer to as steppe ancestry. Ancient DNA confirms that this ancestry entered the Balkans during the early Bronze Age. Yamnaya-associated individuals from sites such as Boyanovo and Mogila in Bulgaria show precisely this genetic composition. Typical modeling of these early steppe-influenced individuals yields approximately 36% EHG, 36% CHG, and around 20 to 25% Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, indicating admixture with local farming populations. The chronology here is critical. Steppe ancestry entered the Balkans during the 3rd millennium BCE, nearly 3,000 years before the medieval migrations of Turkic-speaking groups. The presence of steppe genetic signals in modern Bulgarians therefore cannot be assumed to reflect medieval Inner Asian origins. The Bronze Age expansions and the events of the early Middle Ages belong to entirely different demographic contexts. By the end of the Bronze Age, southeastern Europe was already genetically layered: Neolithic Anatolian-derived farmers, indigenous hunter-gatherers, and steppe pastoralists carrying EHG and CHG ancestry. Modern genome-wide modeling reflects this deep prehistoric structure. When researchers apply distal QP atom models, statistical methods that estimate ancestry by comparing present-day populations to ancient reference groups, modern Bulgarians can be described as deriving roughly 44% of their ancestry from Anatolian Neolithic farmer-related populations, about 43% from steppe-related groups associated with the Bronze Age, and approximately 10% from Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers. Alternative modeling approaches, such as admixture analyses, produce slightly different proportions, roughly 36% for farmer-related components and 37% for steppe-related clusters, yet the overall pattern remains stable. Long before the Slavic migrations, long before the arrival of the Bulgars, long before 681, the Balkans had already been shaped by successive prehistoric movements of people. By the 6th century, the Balkans were no longer a stable frontier of the Byzantine Empire. The reign of Justinian had stretched imperial resources thin. Plague, fiscal strain, and repeated warfare weakened the Danubian defenses. At the same time, the Avar Khaganate exerted pressure across the steppe frontier. It was in this setting that Slavic-speaking groups began moving south of the Danube. Byzantine authors such as Procopius describe these communities in the 6th century as mobile and loosely organized, yet increasingly capable of sustained settlement rather than seasonal raiding. By the late 6th and early 7th centuries, Slavic groups were no longer appearing only as raiders. They were establishing agricultural communities throughout the peninsula. The scaling of these movements has long been debated, but both historical and archaeological scholarship agree on one point. These were not minor incursions. They involved substantial population transfer. By the time the Bulgarian state was established in 681, Slavic-speaking communities were already entrenched across much of the Balkans. The medieval Bulgarian state adopted a Slavic literary language and became one of the main transmitters of Slavic Orthodox culture. That outcome would have been impossible if Slavic-speaking communities had been marginal. They were numerous enough to shape the linguistic framework of the emerging state. Genetics provides another way to approach this question. When researchers compare the DNA of modern Bulgarians to ancient populations, they consistently find a substantial component related to early medieval communities from Central and Eastern Europe, populations closely aligned with early Slavic speakers. The exact proportion depends on how the comparison is structured. Some modeling approaches estimate that slightly more than half of modern Bulgarian ancestry can be traced to these early medieval Central and Eastern European groups. Other methods produce lower figures, often in the range of 40 to 50%. Broader clustering analyses place the Northern and Eastern European-related component closer to the high 30% range. Depending on the method used, estimates typically fall between roughly 1/3 and just over 1/2. Ancient DNA from medieval Bulgarian sites shows that this transformation was already unfolding between the 9th and 12th centuries. Some individuals from this period cluster closely with Balto-Slavic populations of Eastern Europe. Others retain substantial ancestry linked to earlier Balkan populations. Different genetic profiles appear side by side within the same centuries. The remaining question concerns the scale of change. This brings us to a key question. Did the Slavic migrations erase what came before them? The evidence suggests something more complex. When modern Bulgarians are compared genetically to other European populations, they cluster most closely with their Balkan neighbors, Romanians, North Macedonians, and Greeks, rather than with Northern or Eastern Slavic populations, such as Poles or Russians. Although the language is Slavic, the broader genetic profile remains distinctly Southeastern European. Both paternal lineages and whole genome analyses point in the same direction. Modern Bulgarians carry substantial ancestry connected to early Slavic migrations, but they also preserve deep layers inherited from earlier Balkan and Mediterranean populations. The result is neither complete replacement nor unbroken continuity. Instead, it points to gradual integration between medieval migrants and long-established Balkan communities.
This Slavic-speaking society had formed in the Balkans, built upon populations whose roots in the region stretch back thousands of years. The question that remains is how the third component, the Bulgars themselves, fits into this already complex structure.
By the time the Slavic-speaking communities had spread across much of the Balkans, another group was already moving westward. The people who gave Bulgaria its name did not originate in the Balkans. Their earlier political center, known as Old Great Bulgaria, had formed in the early 7th century north of the Black Sea, in the region between the steppe and the Caucasus. When that state fragmented under pressure from the Khazars, one faction, led by Khan Osparok, crossed the Danube and established a new polity in 681. Unlike the loosely organized tribal groups described in earlier Byzantine accounts of the Slavs, the Bulgars appear in the sources as politically structured and militarily organized. They built fortifications, they maintained a ruling hierarchy, they preserved a calendar system and administrative titles. They were not merely another migrating tribe, they arrived as a steppe-forming elite. Most historians classify their language as Turkic, specifically of the Ugaric branch. That classification is linguistic. It describes features of vocabulary, grammar, and inscriptional material. It does not automatically define biological ancestry. Language and genetics do not always move together. Some scholars have argued that the Proto-Bulgar language may have had strong connections to East Iranian languages, similar to those spoken by Sarmatian and Alan groups in the North Caucasus. That remains debated. What is not debated is that early Bulgar rulers used political titles and calendar systems associated with the Western Turkic Khaganate, a powerful steppe empire under whose influence they once lived. Whether this reflects their ethnic background, political dependence, or simply cultural borrowing is still discussed among historians. What we can say with confidence is this: a steppe origin ruling group, whose language is traditionally classified as Turkic, established control over a region where Slavic-speaking communities and older Balkan populations were already living.
The identity of the founders is not in dispute. What remains to be examined is the scale of their contribution to the later population. One way to examine this is through the Y chromosome, which traces paternal lines. Large-scale surveys of modern Bulgarian men show that haplogroups commonly associated with Inner-Asian or Altaic populations, such as C, N, and Q, appear at very low frequencies, together around 1 to 2%. In populations that experienced strong medieval Turkic migrations, these lineages are far more common. In Bulgaria, they are uncommon. This does not mean that no individuals of Eastern origin ever arrived. It simply indicates that their paternal genetic contribution, if present, represents a small fraction of the overall gene pool. Maternal DNA tells a similar story. Analyses of medieval burials from the lower Danube, dated to the 8th and 9th centuries, show overwhelmingly West Eurasian maternal lineages, particularly haplogroups H, K, J, T, and U. East Asian maternal markers are not observed in these samples. Modern Bulgarians continue to display this predominantly West Eurasian maternal profile. When researchers examine the entire genome, not just paternal or maternal lines, the pattern remains consistent. In large comparative studies, modern Bulgarians do not cluster with Inner-Asian nomadic populations, such as the Xiongnu or later medieval steppe confederations. Instead, the additional non-Slavic component visible in their genetic profile aligns more closely with populations from the Caucasus and regions north of it. This is where the Allen hypothesis comes in. Archaeologists have long noticed similarities between early Bulgar sites along the lower Danube and the Saltovo-Mayaki cultural sphere north of the Caucasus. Burial practices, grave orientation, and certain material features resemble those associated with late Sarmatian and Alan groups. Some genetic studies add another layer to this discussion. In principal component analyses, certain ancient Alan samples plot relatively close to the additional Caucasus-related component observed in modern Bulgarians. That does not prove identity, but it does suggest a possible connection. At the same time, restraint is necessary. We do not yet have extensive genome-wide data from clearly identified, high-status Proto-Bulgar elite burials in early Bulgaria. Much of the argument relies on comparative modeling rather than direct sequencing of confirmed ruling class graves. That means the hypothesis remains plausible, but not fully settled. What we can say with real confidence is this: modern Bulgarians do not show a strong genetic link to Inner Asian populations, the kind you would expect if large numbers of medieval Turkic migrants had settled there.
In places like Anatolia, where Turkic migrations were substantial, a noticeable Central Asian genetic signal remains. In Bulgaria, that signal is very small.
So what does that mean? It likely means one of three things. Either the founding Bulgar group was not very large in number, or they ruled as a political elite without dramatically changing the overall population, or they were already genetically similar to other West Eurasian steppe and Caucasus populations before arriving in the Balkans. The historical record preserves Turkic titles and steppe political traditions. The genetic record does not show a substantial inter-Asian demographic signature. That difference is important. The Proto-Bulgars entered this landscape as political organizers and state builders, but their demographic contribution appears to be very modest. This does not reduce their significance. Political influence does not require numerical dominance. A state can be named by one group, ruled by another, and populated by many.
Long before Slavs, long before Bulgars, the Balkans were home to the people the Greeks called Thracians. They were not a small tribe. They were a collection of Indo-European groups spread across much of what is now Bulgaria and parts of southeastern Europe. Their presence stretches back into the Bronze Age. By the first millennium BCE, they had formed kingdoms, minted coins, built fortresses, and left behind the gold treasures that still fill museums today. Their independent political story ended gradually, beginning in the 2nd century BCE and completed by 46 CE. The region was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Over the next several centuries, the local population became integrated into Roman administrative and economic life. Cities grew, trade expanded, Latin and Greek spread. By late antiquity, the old Thracian tribal identities had largely dissolved into a Roman provincial society. That is how the Thracians appear in written history. The genetic evidence gives us a different angle. Ancient DNA shows that Thracian-era individuals were not genetically pure in any simple sense. By the time we reach the Iron Age, the Balkans had already experienced thousands of years of movement and mixing. Thracian-associated samples show a blend of ancestry from earlier Anatolian farmers and Bronze Age steppe groups, along with smaller amounts of local hunter-gatherer ancestry. In other words, even the Thracians were already the product of earlier migrations. When these Iron Age Balkan samples are placed on genetic comparison charts, they sit between Southern European farming populations and steppe-influenced groups. They look like what we would expect from a region that had served for millennia as a crossroads between Europe and Anatolia. The Thracians, then, were not a frozen remnant of some untouched ancient population. They were themselves the product of earlier waves of migration and mixture. The next question that naturally follows is whether modern Bulgarians can be described as direct descendants of these Iron Age populations. Genome-wide modeling allows researchers to approach that question in measured terms. When modern Bulgarians are statistically compared to Iron Age samples from the region, the contribution from those local Iron Age populations is generally estimated at around 12 to 15%. That is not trivial. It represents real continuity, but it is also not the primary layer of the modern gene pool. By contrast, ancestry associated with early medieval Slavic-related populations forms a substantially larger share of the modern Bulgarian gene pool. Depending on the modeling approach and the reference population selected, estimates generally fall roughly between 37 and 56%. The Roman period also introduced additional ancestry from Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Later centuries added smaller contributions. Taken together, the pattern does not support a story of uninterrupted descent from Iron Age Thracians, nor does it support total replacement. What we see instead is partial survival within a broader process of transformation. The Iron Age population remained present, but it became one strand within a much larger and more complex fabric. Scholars are careful here for a reason. Ancient names do not map neatly onto modern genetic identities. The people called Thracians were cultural communities in a specific historical context. Modern populations are the result of many centuries of movement, integration, and change. It is tempting to draw a straight line from ancient Thracians to modern Bulgarians. Genetics does not support that kind of linear continuity. What it shows instead is partial survival within a much larger process of transformation. So we began with a simple question. If the state was founded by a Turkic-speaking elite, if the language today is Slavic, and if the land was once home to the Thracians,
Then what are modern Bulgarians, biologically speaking? When modern Bulgarians are compared to other European populations, they cluster most closely with their Balkan neighbors. Their genetic profile aligns with Romanians, Greeks, and other South Slavic populations. Despite the Slavic language, they are not genetically positioned alongside Northern or Eastern Slavic groups such as the Poles or Russians. Their place is firmly Southeastern European. A substantial portion of their ancestry traces to early medieval Slavic-related populations. That helps explain how the Slavic language became dominant and why the demographic balance of the region shifted during the early Middle Ages. Beneath that layer is something much older. Bronze Age steppe ancestry entered the Balkans thousands of years before the medieval period. It forms a major part of the genetic foundation of the region. This prehistoric layer should not be confused with later Turkic movements. The two are separated by millennia and by distinct genetic signatures.
As for Inter-Asian ancestry, typically associated with medieval Turkic expansions, it appears only at minimal levels in modern Bulgaria. The founders of the state left a political and historical imprint far greater than their measurable genetic contribution. And as for the Thracians, their ancestry did not vanish, yet it did not remain intact either. It survives as one component within a population that has been reshaped repeatedly over time. What the evidence reveals is neither purity nor erasure. It reveals accumulation. Languages shifted, political identities formed, states rose and disappeared, but populations blended. Genetic structure changes gradually through mixture and continuity, not through simple replacement stories. When the debate asks whether Bulgarians are Slavic, Turkic, or Thracian, it assumes that identity must have a single root. But the reality is a completely different story. Layer upon layer across millennia, the Balkans became what they are today. Modern Bulgarians are not the biological echo of one ancient tribe. They are the product of a crossroads, shaped by prehistoric farmers, Bronze Age pastoralists, Roman-era migrations, Slavic-speaking communities, and a state-building elite from the steppe. And that is what the genetics actually shows.